Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of Real Talk with a Unicorn. My name is Tatiana and I'm a recruiter in supply chain and logistics. Mark Anthony once said, if you do what you love, you won't work a day in your life. What holds us back from choosing the path that we were born, equipped, and meant to fulfill? This and many other interesting topics I'm going to discuss today with Dr. Jonathan Tam, PhD from the University of Oxford, active director at Tyndall University, and a career clarity coach. Welcome to the show, Dr. Tam.
Thank you for having me.
It is my pleasure, and I will be asking you questions on behalf of my audience, and some of those questions at some point in my life were very important to me, so I really want to know your perspective. You spent about 13 years in education, actively studying sociology, culture, as well as teaching. However, in 2018, you decided to become a career clarity coach. I would like to know more about that decision and your logic behind that decision. Why did you make it?
Yeah, I'd love to share my journey on how I came to being a career clarity coach. And, a lot of things only make sense in retrospect when you think back. And reminds me of what Steve Jobs once said at the Stanford University graduation ceremony. He says, when you're going through it, doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you look back, everything just kind of makes sense. So just let's take a walk down memory lane. When I first started in college, I followed my passion and I went to study history, right? And it's not being a neighborhood that I'm from in Toronto. Not a lot of Chinese kids go and study history. We all go do something else, like just following a stereotype, but the stereotypes are based on some degree of truth. So I went to study history, and it's like, I'll follow my passion and I'll figure it out. And to be honest, I didn't really figure it out. I kind of bumbled my way into education, because with a history degree, what are you gonna do, right? Oh, I guess I'll teach, right? So I decided to be a teacher. When I was a teacher, I enjoyed it at first. I worked my butt off and I became a department head, in a few years' time. And I was working at an international school. And at that time, I pushed myself to the limit because I went really hard. And really, it kind of felt like purposeless, but I felt like, okay, it's I'll find it in the struggle. And I didn't find it in the struggle. In fact, I almost died during the struggle. I had, during one of the conferences in Thailand, I started having these spots on my waist. And then I was like, okay, it's pain, whatever. I got a high pain threshold. I'll sleep 4 hours. I'll keep working, right? And then it slowly made its way around my waist. And then at some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I have a very high pain threshold, but I'm not invincible. So I went to the hospital for expats. And then the doctor told me, he was like, John, if you didn't come in, you'd be dead the next day. And then apparently I had shingles. And I had it for like a whole week without doing anything about it. And so they put me under morphine for like a whole week. And at that time, I was like super stressed. I was applying for my PhD. I was department head. I just had my second daughter born. There was a huge fiasco happening at the school that I was teaching at that time. And there was just a whole bunch of things I had to juggle. And, just working my butt off, I couldn't find the purpose in it as well. And then when I went to grad school, I went to Penn first for my master's, and then I went to Oxford for my PhD. And I figured, I'll find it out there. Can't find it. Like you don't get that clarity just by working in the field. You kind of figure out what you don't like. And when I was, when I wrapped up my PhD at Oxford, I was applying for different faculty positions, because that's natural career path. When you're at Oxford and you're doing your PhD, the natural mindset is you're going to enter academia as a professor somewhere. And when I was writing those letters and I was typing up, oh yeah, I'm passionate about researching this, I felt like my soul was dying because I was lying. I was like, I don't like this. I can do academic research. I published in the top journals, but I didn't like it. And then I decided, like, you know what, forget it. I'm not going to apply. Like, I'm not going to apply for faculty positions. I'm at a faculty position now in Toronto, but it's kind of more of a juggle. But I go back and I think, as a kid, being raised in a Chinese family, my parents mean well, and they told me that, hey, you have the ability to get your PhD in the future. And then that idea was planted in my head, and I fulfilled it.
Mm-hmm.
But I look at a lot of the other peers that I have growing up, and I grew up in a really Chinese neighborhood. It's like, it's not for everybody. Some people suffer from this, right? And I went through this whole journey and it's like, it's something I'm really passionate about, because, through this introspective process, through this whole process, I finally figured out like, oh, there are some really essential elements to making someone really passionate and fulfilled in their work. And this is what I want to tell other people as well and teach other people as well.
Oh, that's resonated with me too, because I chose the path of recruiter for the same reason. I do believe that every single person is born with certain talent or a few strengths that they are really good at. And sometimes we choose different paths. We prefer to focus on social success and how it's seen from the society perspective and forget about ourselves. You mentioned that your soul was dying and you had the second daughter born at that time. Many people choose to stay where they are because they have financial obligations, they have commitments, you had young kids. How did you pause and actually decided to take this leap of faith, so to speak? Because many people will, how do you address that when people approach you and ask for advice? Because many people stay where they are for that exact reason, for the security purpose.
Yeah, and this is a tough one. Everyone's got their own unique situation. Everyone's got their own unique challenges. Some people, their challenge may not be financial. Their challenge may be, hey, there's some people in my life that I really need to support.
Mm,
And for some people, the challenge may be financial, or some people, the challenge may be like, physical. They've got health problems. Everyone's got their own cross to bear. And I think in the case of different people, you really need to evaluate your situation and your position. In
mm,
my case, having done grad school, I lived in Korea for 5 years teaching there,
mm,
right? And then I moved to the States at Penn for grad school for 1 year, and then I went to Oxford for the time that I needed to be there. And then, during that time, I was doing research in Hong Kong, I was doing research in China, and then I was back in Canada, just flying all over the place. At that point, while I was typing up the applications, like, do I really want? Because realistically, what happens in the academic journey is that you have to go apply for postdocs, move around, and then hope you'll land in a assistant professorship somewhere.
mm,
And even that's not a guarantee. Do I really want to be hauling my kids and my family across wherever in the world in
mm,
hopes of landing a faculty position? And things worked out, in staying in Toronto. And so I weighed everything. And actually, at the end of the day, the decision was, hey, staying in Toronto where there's family support, where there's people who I can care for, and people who can help us out with our kids. I got 3 kids. They're like
mm.
11, 8, and 6 now. And it just weighing these things and really doing basically a cost benefit analysis. And it's like, what's the best path moving forward? And you really need to sort these out, because nowadays, one of the big things on the internet, and especially prevalent in social media, especially for millennials, it's like, hey, follow your dream, follow your passion, the solopreneurship, the entrepreneurship thing. That's a huge message that's getting pushed out, especially for the millennial demographic. But it's not for everyone. Not everyone's personality is suited for that. Not everyone, their own personal burdens can handle that. And I think it's somewhat irresponsible for that message to be such a big message nowadays. Like, I understand branding, I understand your personal branding, and you got to really find something to work for that's inspires passion.
Mhm.
But at the same time, not everyone's cut out for certain jobs, and the good life may not be the good life for you. So
Exactly. And very often those messages, they're like one size fits all. But as you mentioned, every single person is so different. And sometimes we have to give up certain things. Let's say you decided to stay in Toronto, you had other choices in the world that from the social perspective may be more interesting and appealing. So definitely people have to make their own evaluation and do some adjustments to their lifestyle. But of course, every decision you make has to be your own decision, and you have to take responsibility fully for all the steps that you take. And this is a very entrepreneurial spirit. Not every person has that strength, but everybody has their own talent in something else. So these days, when people approach you as a career clarity coach, what is the most popular questions? Can you list a few for us, please?
well, yeah, and when people approach me, the first thing they want is change, right? And change, a lot of people say like, yeah, I want to change in my career. And then I need to ask the clarifying question. Do you mean a career change or do you mean just a change? And I think that's a very valid question, because when you think about change in your career, it's like if you've been spending 10 years developing your skills in education, for example, in my
Mhm.
case, spent a lot of time in education, working as a teacher, learning how to write curriculum, learning how to teach, learning, in my case, history. You know, if you switch to something else, you're basically starting from scratch.
Yeah.
And is that something that you really want to do? And a lot of times people may have a foul experience or negative experience with under a toxic boss or a bad workplace environment or whatever. And then the question is, I help them work through, like, do you really want to go through this change? And so there's really 5 outcomes. I'll go through them quickly. The
Mhm.
first outcome is changing the job to you. When you go into a workplace, and there are certain aspects of work that doesn't fit you, the
Mhm.
best thing you can do is adjust the job to you and stay in the same job, right? If that's possible,
If that's
right? And it really depends on the particular job. The next thing you can do is adjust yourself to a job by building a lot of soft skills or upskilling. And that's the typical journey that people choose to do. And then the last three are basically real switches, and one of them is doing a functional switch. You switch the functions within the same company. The other one is doing an industry switch. You switch to a different industry, performing the same function. So if you were in HR at Nike, for example, you go to Amazon and you keep doing HR. And the last thing, which is the hardest thing to do, is called a double switch, which is essentially you switch both industry and function. And by listing these things out for my clients, and then they sort through like, which one do I actually want to do, by doing a cost benefit analysis and looking at what are my interests, what are my skills, what education do I need, how do I close the skill gap.
Mhm.
The Working through this systematically will give people so much more clarity than just like, I hate my job, I hate my boss, and I want to switch. And they make a haphazard decision to switch to another career when it's not really, in their best interest.
And that's right. I'm glad you mentioned those 5 aspects, because a lot of times we don't clarify what exactly we want to change, and we think that the new job it's going to be a solution to our internal state. But if we switch the same job for something that we didn't really evaluate properly, and it all starts with honesty. I like how you asked yourself those questions. Am I happy? Is this what I want to do? You notice that your soul was dying at that time. Many people, they avoid this self-awareness. So when the right decision comes, they don't see that. You have to be ready for those new ideas. If you are searching for something fulfilling and it comes your way, you should be able to recognize it. Without honesty with yourself, it's really hard to do. I really like that you were brave enough to take this leap of faith, and first of all to ask yourself those questions and to answer them honestly. That's, I think, the most important step that many people avoid. um, right now you mentioned millennials. How would you describe your groups age-wise? Who is struggling the most, and what type of questions come from different generations?
Well, this is based on the Deloitte study that came out. I think it's been 2 years now, but they do regular surveys on the millennial and Gen Z demographics, because they're the up and coming ones. Um, 10 years ago, people would be trashing the millennials a lot, saying, you guys don't know what they're doing. But as a sociologist, it's actually a life stage thing. When you are in your 20s,
Mhm.
right, there are certain characteristics of work that you're like. But when you hit your 30s and you start having family responsibilities, you may have to start taking care of people in your life, such as your parents.
Mhm.
Um, the whole equation changes. And so a lot of times when you look at generations, sure, each generation has their own social impact factors,
Mhm.
such as the civil rights movement in the 60s, or like the technological boom in the 90s and 2000s, right? These are all defining factors. If we look at the millennial demographic, the main defining factor is, number one, the dot-com boom. They lived and they grew up through the dot-com boom. And then the other thing is that they went through the Great Recession, and they actually don't have a lot of faith in big corporations. And that's actually reflected in all the Deloitte studies, where it's like every generation for millennials, they find that they are markedly higher in terms of their distrust towards big corporations compared to the Gen Z generation,
Mhm.
who really grew up during the post '08 recession. Their trust towards corporation and their proclivity towards stability is much higher than millennials, who tend to be more risk taking. And so it's just an interesting dynamic. And right now, also, that's why you see on social media a lot of millennials coming out and branding themselves and doing their own thing. It's because they don't have a lot of trust in organizations. They want to stand out for themselves and brand themselves and sell themselves, and just have the cult of the individual is much stronger in terms of the mindset, in terms of career wise. So I think demographically, this is an interesting characteristic, and it's also very entrepreneurial in spirit, like you said.
Mhm.
So that's something that the workplace needs to look out for in the future as well.
That's very important because millennials, they do enter workforce, they still enter big corporations, and they face a lot of frustration because they don't see mm, that they are understood in a way that they expect to be understood by senior management. You talk about soft skills a lot. I know that these days, when people, new grads, millennials enter the workforce, they often don't have office etiquette. They lack certain soft skills. Can you list a few soft skills that are absolutely critical for millennials to have if they are entering big corporations or smaller companies, but if they're entering the office world to start their career?
In probably the most important soft skill that I would say, in sociology we call it signaling. In normal day-to-day life we call it communication, right? But communication is more like, you have to be more deliberate in terms of, either it's you vocalize it, or you have body language, your posture, the written communication. That's communication. But signaling is a little bit more. It's also what you wear or how you mirror people. So one of the things that you coach people on during interviews is mirroring, right? And there's something called the homophily principle. And what homophily means, people are homophilic, meaning you like those who are similar to yourself. And that's basically in anything you signal, whether it's your race, your gender, your language, your accent, your skills,
Mhm.
and whether you're an extrovert, you're an introvert. And so one fact is that extroverts speak faster. They simply speak faster. Introverts, they
Wait.
slow down the way they talk. And when you're in an interview, you first of all, you got to identify who's the one who's making the hiring decision.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you need to mirror them, right? And that's all part of the whole signaling skill set. You know how to signal different things, and part of signaling is also self-awareness.
Yes, exactly. And
And that's
self-awareness
exactly what you said.
is the birthplace of emotional intelligence. It starts with self-awareness. Without
Absolutely.
knowing who you are, you really struggle with mirroring and identifying who the other person is, right? So it all goes down to emotional intelligence these days. I'm so lucky that it's becoming very popular and it's available. And I encourage people to investigate soft skills, to learn more about their personal development and have a development plan. Because often we are growing through our life experience. We are learning things about ourselves and we become better human beings with age, right? So if you know who you are, where you stand, and where you want to be, you can identify what skills you need to work on. And it's also helpful during the interview, during the conversation, when people are aware of what skills they need to work on, what their strengths are. The conversation goes in a different way when you're confident in who you are and what you want from life, from your career. That's
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought up skills, because when you talk about skills, you got to separate hard skills and soft skills,
Mhm.
right? And nowadays, when you think about hard skills, let's talk about hard skills first briefly.
Oh,
Um, Hard skills are being replaced. And what the types of hard skills that are being replaced are the rote ones and what we call narrow hard skills. So cashier, no one aspires to be a cashier nowadays, because that's basically going, like, if people have self checkout everywhere,
mm,
right? Or monotonous tasks. where whether it's like manipulating pixels, that's what the computer is really good at. And with automation and AI and machine learning and big data, what's going to be replaced are narrow hard skills. But if you have broad hard skills that are problem solving, for example, or dealing with complex things, or dealing with things that you need to sign off on in terms of safety, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if someone's going to break down my wall and work on the pipes behind it and electricity behind it, they better sign off on it, right? So these are complex hard skills that are difficult to replace. But if you're talking about soft skills, and sorry, the hard skills are what gets you through the door and what qualifies you for the job. But in a job interview process, as you would know very well, that simply qualifies you. You're one of like the 5 or 10 qualified candidates for a single position. But what happens is, what do they look at next? They look at the how, right? How do you fit? Your why. Why are you doing this? Why are you applying to our company? What's the mission and vision alignment between the organization and yourself? And the soft skills is what separates you for that. How do you fit? And then furthermore, if you want to climb the ranks, the higher you climb, the less hard skills you actually need. You need to know what they are. You need to know, like, have an idea of what the problem is. But the more soft skills you need to exhibit. And that's why leadership, at the end of the day, the strategy, right? You focus more on strategy and less on the tactics. And that's the broader direction. And that's all soft skill stuff. And so if you want to have workplace longevity, if you want to climb the corporate ladder, if you want to excel and separate yourself from other candidates, hard skills just gets your foot through the door. It's the soft skills that helps you climb the ranks.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Sam, I like that we started talking about career. Does a good school guarantee your good career or happiness? Because you graduated from Oxford, you're very versatilely educated and you have friends with the same type of education. Does it guarantee you success?
No, it does not. I think going to an elite school like Penn, like Oxford, one of the major benefits is the network and the quality of, you really know what excellence is, and you really know the standard is set very high. But it's the same thing. Like, it's like a race. If you're running a race, but you're running in a different direction, it's not aligned to what you want to do, then the whole thing is pointless. So I know people who were in my cohorts while I was Penn and Oxford, and they got a top-notch education, but you can't really say they know what they really want to do in their life. And so at the end of the day, having that career clarity is the very first step. And one thing that a lot of people ask me is, should I go back to school? Should I go to grad school? And the answer is almost always like, what do you want to do? It depends. Because going to grad school, one of the things that can happen to you is you can become overqualified. And one thing that that really shows up during the work process is, if you see a PhD on someone's resume, and I'm sure you're a recruiter, you would know this. If you see a PhD on someone, you would automatically have certain biases about that individual.
Well, the first time I told you, I was like super nervous. It's really hard to put someone into the position because you have this biased attitude, right, towards someone's profile. You can start picturing this person being very smart, having certain attitude, demanding certain pay, and you're right, to your point, it limits your opportunities actually.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I actually recommend people to do is, if they have a PhD, remove it. You can remove it, right? And it's not that you're hiding it, but it's not relevant to the job at hand. And so when you get to the interview, and then after you exhibit all your soft skills and people think you're a great candidate and you're a fit, then you can break it to them like, I actually have a PhD, but I decided to leave it off my resume because it's not relevant to the task at hand. And that's perfectly fine, because by then you would have your foot in the door. But during the resume process, what happens is that hiring managers and recruiters, they're on full out bias mode. They're looking for a cookie cutter fit for a certain skill set and a certain experience background, and having a PhD on there just might not help you, or even having a master's in the wrong field may not help you. So at the end of the day, going to a good school, yeah, that's great. You have a wonderful network, you meet people there, and you have a wonderful experience. But at the end of the day, what do you really want to do with your life? That's what really matters.
And why do you think it is so different to, so difficult to understand what you really want to do in your life? Why is it such a struggle for people, and myself included? It took me 8 years to find out what it is I really want to do. What do you think prevents us from being very clear on our career and on our dreams?
I think, like you said, the main thing is self-awareness.
Mhm.
Um, and I think nowadays, in a world where there's a lot of noise, self-awareness is becoming increasingly difficult. The education system doesn't particularly help, and that's one of the critiques on education nowadays. It's you're focused on standardized testing, and when you're focused on standardized testing, you're preparing the people to answer certain questions and so on. This is especially in the States, Canada less so. But when you're preparing people to tick certain boxes, and then you incentivize teachers to teach in a certain way so that then schools can get that funding. This is in the States as well. And what happens as a result is you create this monster where everyone's focusing on ticking the boxes, making sure they fit certain criteria, fit certain boxes, and fit certain descriptions. And then you have social media, right? People glorifying certain types of lifestyles and so on. And then at the same time, you have a lot of parents who are like, oh, am I falling behind? Am I falling behind? And so they send their kids to learn this, and that, right? And they pack this kid's schedule. But one of the most important things about self-awareness is quiet and boredom. And Susan Cain book, Quiet, is amazing because it's about really, and it's talking about the power of the introvert, and it's really allowing a person to look deep inside, resist the stimuli and just really look inside. But at the same time, there's also with the, I forgot her name. There's another book that came out that's talking about social media, where a lot of young people are just looking at these things and then they're just like, oh, this is the good life, this is the good life. But they don't really think, hey, is this good for me? Am I a fit for this? And then education doesn't really help you as well. In Ontario, there's a grade 10 careers course, but then at the same time, it's seen as a bird course, and the teachers that are slotted in there aren't particularly, fit for it. And then in counseling, the main focus right now is on mental health and depression and anxiety. But and so there's a consensus in OSCA, which is the Ontario School Counselors Association. There's a consensus that career counseling is a major priority, but school resources are limited, and there's a other priority right now in terms of mental health. And so you're talking about ratios of 400 students to one school counselor in high school. When you get to college or university, if you go to a big university, you're talking about 1,600 students to one counselor, that kind of ratio. So you don't get that support. And that's why it's really hard for anyone to really have this quietness, this stillness, to really have this boredom to to look and explore. And boredom is super important for like creativity, self-awareness, just being in touch with yourself. Because if you're always bombarded with stimuli, you won't have time to gain that self-awareness.
And from that perspective, pandemic and lockdown situation seems to be beneficial to the point where you learn more about yourself, you learn more about your preferences, and you have time to reflect without being rushed into some other activities that distract you every day from that internal travel, right? So these days, I'm sure many people are revising their values and their own definition of success.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I found in sales in particular, you have this certain stereotypical success model that you have to pursue in order to gain certain numbers. But not everybody's success is the same, and you definitely have to live on your own terms and do not pursue things that really are not yours. So having your own definition of success, and I saw it in Gary Vee, he mentioned that his definition of success is if I'm happy, I'm successful. And that applies to my life too. If I'm happy, which is lifestyle, what I do, who I work with, who I communicate with, what I wear and what I eat, if I'm happy with all that, I'm successful. And there is no other person on earth who can tell me what I need to do in order to feel successful. It should be me, and it should be you, and it's very individual. It's very unique to every person.
Absolutely. You gotta have your own definition of success.
Yes, and Dr. Tam, you mentioned parents, you mentioned conditioning in the early childhood that we need to be ahead of everybody, this competitiveness that sometimes is useless. It wears you out, it makes you sick, and that is not necessarily in many cases. Do you have a message for parents, those who have their 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds, maybe teenagers? Can you tell something to the parents?
Yeah, I think when we talk about success, let's just bring it back a little bit and talk about success and what really satisfies someone. Gary Vee uses the term happiness, but when we look at happiness, happiness is actually quite fleeting as an emotion, right? And you can't really pinpoint what happiness is. So like you would because that it comes and goes, and it goes so quickly, and then after that high you're back where you started, right? So a lot of people have these like emotions, outbursts of emotions where it's ecstatic, and afterwards you go back to the mundane. And that's actually what we call emotional rhythms in social psychology. There has to be up and downs, and it's okay for there to be up and downs as long as the highs aren't too highs and the lows aren't too lows.
As long as it's not like extremes that you're jumping, like plus 100, minus 100, that's toxic.
Yeah, that's toxic. If you're at like 100 and then you drop back to a 40, and then because we need to recharge we need to recharge our batteries as well. If you go to an NBA game, if I go to the Raptors, and for myself, I'm not a full out extrovert. I'm extroverted, but I'm not a full extrovert. I'm kind of like an ambivert extrovert. What happens is if I go to a Raptors game, I sit down. The first 3 quarters, if I'm tired by the first 3 quarters, if I start yelling at too much, by the 4th quarter, I don't want to stand. I'm really tired. Unless the game's really exciting, it's like I'm burnt out. And so I think what happens is what happiness is. One of the best definitions for happiness that I know that's out there in terms of being satisfied, being fulfilled, is actually something called flow psychology. And this is by a psychologist called Csikszentmihalyi. His name's impossible to pronounce, but I figured it out. And its spelling is even worse. But what flow psychology is there's, the X and Y axis. Think about the X and the Y axis. One axis is what we call is the difficulty axis, right? Whether something's very difficult or very easy. The other axis is their skill axis, whether you are highly skilled or you are not skilled. What happens if your x-axis, if your difficulty is too high and the skill is too low? What that creates is, anxiety. Right? Anxiety. It's like if I go and play basketball with NBA players, I'll be anxious, right? Because there's no way I can keep up with them. Now, if your skill is high or versus relative to the difficulty, what happens is that it's boredom. If I go and play basketball with my kids, it's not competitive. It's not even a competition, and you'll get bored, right? And you can take the joy in having family time, but it's boredom.
You're not challenged in a healthy way.
You're not challenged, exactly. If your work is in either situation, then you need to reflect on how you can adjust the job to you. Like I said at the beginning, that's probably the best thing that you can do. The optimal state for anybody working is to have an optimal level of difficulty and an optimal level of skill. And how do you know that? It's when you spend 45 minutes on something. When you feel like you spent 45 minutes on something, but you actually spent like 3 hours on it. When time flies by and because you're so engaged in something.
Headhunting. When I'm doing headhunt, I'm covered with papers and maps. Sometimes I do it on the floor, and it takes 3-4 hours, but it actually feels like half an hour.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an awesome feeling. That's actually when you are fully engaged. That's when you're fully satisfied and you're just engaged. And that's where a huge source of satisfaction is from. Whether it's at work, whether it's at home, right? For example, if I'm happily married and I work well and I would work well with my wife, but sometimes when she gets difficult and my skill isn't there, which tends to be the case in terms of communication skill, right? it's anxiety inducing. I'm like, oh man, I don't know what's going on. What can I do, right? So whether it's at home or whether it's at work or whether it's your hobbies, you want to find that optimal flow state and then slowly increase the difficulty in a
Mhm.
way that it's still challenging, but you're not out of your depths. And knowing how to tweak that so that it's the optimal balance is probably the best suggestion I have for parents, whether it's, for their own work or even for their own kids, like, finding something that's challenging for the kids. Um, and one of the things is maybe boredom. You might think that, hey, my kid's been playing Lego for like 4 hours straight. Aren't they bored? Well, the thing is, once they get bored, they'll increase the difficulty. They'll find another challenge automatically. And kids are wonderful for that, right? And we know that from child psychology. Kids, look for stimuli. Adults somehow, for some reason, we kind of forget that. And we just, stick to the routine. We think like, oh, this is my box. I don't really want to step out of it. But can you change the box? Can you change the shape of the box?
Or the couple
Change
of
the nature of work?
blocks.
Yeah, exactly. Right. There's a lot of things that you can tailor, and
Mhm.
and that's probably the best advice I can give to parents and for their own work and for teaching their kids.
Yeah, so not exhaust their kids in the competitive area where they definitely cannot, obviously, and start searching for what they gravitate to. And of course, um, keep them challenged and observe them challenging themselves. It's a joy. It's a joy, definitely. And I, there was a test when I did for my son at 1 years old. I kind of tried to explore what he gravitates to, and I can see that he's a little warrior. That's why we want to put him in sports, but at the same time, he likes acting. So there is no stigma around it. So boys do hockey or girls do play piano. It has to be in line with the personality, I think. And
Yeah.
definitely don't look around what other people are doing and where your neighbors are sending their kids. It's very important to stay true to yourself. And it starts with parents. It starts with parenting by example. The
Yeah,
parents, if
and it's a balancing act, because sometimes the child, you may feel that the child is, they're doing the same thing over and over again, but
Mhm.
if that's what they're comfortable with, then sure. But sometimes at the same time, they might not know what's out there, so you may have to introduce new things, like, hey, what do you think about this? Give this a try,
Yeah.
right? And if they want to give it a try, awesome. If not, then they'll eventually get bored. Don't worry about that. They will eventually get
Yes,
bored.
they won't hide that for sure. And that self-discovery journey, doesn't matter how old you are, it's never too late to start asking yourself honest questions. Something like, what do I want to eat for breakfast? What do I want to wear? It starts with small things. You have to become in tune with yourself. You have to know your tastes, your preferences, your values. And sometimes if you don't know what you like to do, it's very important to know what you do not like to do. It's the first step. I think Oprah brought it up at some point. If don't worry about not knowing what you're good at, know exactly what you don't like and avoid that. So take care
Yeah.
of yourself, listen to yourself. And I know, Dr. Tam, you mentioned that you are running a series of seminars,
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
seminar, career coaching. Can you please tell us more about it? And of course, I'm happy to invite all of you guys to attend Dr. Tam's seminars. You will get huge insights on career clarity, and I'm sure that Doctor will help you with choosing your career in line with your personality.
Yeah. So for the first week of August, I'll be hosting a series of seminars and webinars, and they're essentially the same, right? Um, and it's going to be, Monday to Thursday. Every day there's a different time slot, so you can fit different people's schedules. And essentially, the topic is how to find your dream career, how to get unstuck in your career. And so basically, what I'm going to give everyone is the overall strategy that I use for my career coaching, and share with everyone, this is how I approach it, this is what I do. And I hope everyone can get a lot of value out of it.
And of course, all links, all information is going to be on LinkedIn, on my profile, on Dr. Tam's profile, and also Dr. Jonathan Tam has his own YouTube channel. You're welcome to subscribe and watch his amazing videos about soft skills, about career advice. And I also watched the graduation at Oxford. It was quite it was quite an interesting one. It's like a view from the inside, and I like what professors were saying. Thank you very much for sharing that. And Dr. Tam, thank you for your time today. I know how precious it is. I appreciate that you've been with us for almost an hour today, and I look forward to sharing this video with everybody else.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.